3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All right, welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, Ben Baumann, and today I'm going to be talking about what does it mean to be free? So throughout our existence as a species, we have definitely had a lot of interesting lifestyles that people can think about or debate when it comes to, what does freedom mean? Our species, Homo sapiens, has been around for roughly 300,000 years. And obviously, at the very beginning, life was kind of this pure natural freedom in small hunter-gatherer societies, traveling, migrating, hunting, and just trying to survive. There was this naturalistic freedom to that. However, as we started to migrate and interact with other people, we began building bigger groups, eventually creating permanent settlements around 12,000 years ago during the Neolithic Revolution. And you still had freedom, but you're also now confined to a certain area. And the advantage was you no longer had to worry about starving every day because you had this home base where a community of people were working together to provide food and shelter and water. And with permanent settlements came the birth of agriculture around 10,000 years ago, which was a game changer. The food supply then became drastically more stable. You didn't have to roam constantly. Even with permanent settlements, you still had to move around depending on the seasons. And at the same time, though, by transitioning to these more permanent societies, you also had to give up some of that raw freedom and have to follow these rules of the society that you've settled into and making compromises and agreeing with these other people that, okay, we're going to live together in this community, but this is how things are going to happen. And this was very successful overall, which is why it continued to grow and expand further, resulting in civilizations beginning to emerge around 6,000 years ago. And with this, you had the rise of kings ruling large populations and armies and written laws defining how people should live. And with this improved lifestyle, again, you had this trade-off of freedom. But your lifestyle, again, faces further restrictions on, you can just do whatever you want. Obviously, with civilizations, people started to pay taxes and other things because you actually have governance now with civilizations forming. And this brought about a really big challenge then for human society because, yes, you obviously want the protection, you want the access to food and shelter that civilization brings. At the same time, though, your freedom, because you're now following all these different rules and laws to live in this civilization, has declined a bit over time. You're no longer just kind of yourself out in nature, able to make whatever decision you want. Instead, you have to abide by these agreements to live as part of this society. The problem is finding the balance there, because throughout ancient history, authoritarian rulers would emerge and have existed for thousands of years as a result of this transition to ancient society, to civilizations. For example, Sumerian kings or Egyptian pharaohs began to exist. And this then struggle between centralized power and individual freedom really started to break out, where people had to kind of figure out, okay, what's the best way to live in a civilization while at the same time maintaining the freedom to have a part in this process of deciding things on behalf of this civilization that you're a part of. Because when you have some king or you have a pharaoh or an emperor, essentially it's up to them. One person's making all the rules for the most part, or maybe one person and their advisors that they rely on for insight in their decisions. But ultimately, it's just one person. Everyone else, though, as part of that agreement, you have to then follow the rules of this civilization. But 2,500 years ago in ancient Athens, something new emerged called democracy, where people started making decisions collectively and voting on things. Athens was a direct democracy, so people had one vote per person. And then later you would have the Roman Republic being established around 2,500 years ago, which introduced representative democracy with senators and magistrates to make decisions based off of the people that elected them. And these were the early experiments in balancing security and freedom, but they were fragile. Democracies could be lost because people could be manipulated into electing leaders who cared more about power than freedom. And by preying on people's fears, you can manipulate them into giving you power because you just tell them, you know what? I have a quick fix solution and I will protect you. All you have to do is just give me the power and I'll take care of everything. You don't have to worry anymore. In reality, quick fix solutions don't actually exist in life. Everything is complex. And it's that intellectual laziness to assume that one person can just come in and fix everything is what kills democracies over time. So now fast forwarding to about 250 years ago, the United States would kind of rebirth this democracy movement around the world. The ancient world, democracy eventually would fall and go away. And in 1776, the United States would mark the rise of modern democracy and lead to, over time, the spread of these modern democratic ideals across the globe, resulting in democracies across Western Europe, democracies rising in Eastern Europe, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, democracies rising in Asia, especially after the Cold War and World War II, and in Africa, in the Middle East, in South America. So across the globe, democracy has spread like crazy thanks to the influence of the United States, and the United States going on to become this dominant world power with lots of influence. But the world is always changing, and the battle for freedom and democracy is something that is always ongoing, especially when things change how society works. For example, in the modern era, starting in the 1990s, we have the birth of the internet, which then gives birth to things like social media in the 2000s. And then in the 2020s, we see the birth of artificial intelligence. On top of these technological changes, societies are changing, populations are mixing, globalization has continued to increase, and you have people with different religious beliefs or different cultural beliefs mixing more and more. And things are, complex as a result of that. People then, as a result of these changes, and given how there have been more technological advances in the last 50 years than all of human history, things are happening rapidly fast, much more so than we ever seen before in human history. And this has resulted in a lot of fear and confusion, thus making people vulnerable to authoritarianism because they want to have some sense of understanding and control over all these different changes happening in the world. And so a person then, just like thousands of years ago, can step in and promise to put an end to the chaos and provide security in exchange for power. So ultimately, this begs the question then, are we prepared to recognize when someone is seeking power to really become some sort of authoritarian ruler instead of to help make a democracy better? But this requires also a society that is educated enough to recognize those key differences, because freedom disappears when knowledge disappears and when critical thinking fails. So because that, people today in a society, in a world that is now undergoing so much change, that authoritarianism is on the rise because of this, because there's so many opportunists out there just waiting to get their chance to take advantage of the chaos, to empower themselves, enrich themselves, and control things. People then now have to be extra careful with what they read online. There's so much fake information out there, especially on social media, which has become a total crapshoot in terms of what's legitimate and what's not. People need to understand sources and where they're coming from and what sources are biased and why they're biased to better understand the motives of those creating this information, whether it's legitimate or not. And ultimately, people have to be aware of easy solutions and governance, because as in life, there are none. So with that, this is a critical point in human history, and what freedom we will still have going ahead into the future. The freedom of speech, the freedom to have a role in making decisions on behalf of your society, and the freedom to criticize your leaders. These are all things that are not set in stone, and they can disappear at any time when enough people abandon critical thinking and common sense for that quick fix. It's kind of like authoritarianism is a drug in many respects, because once you really latch on to some populist wannabe authoritarian leader, it tends to become kind of like a cult. And you become stuck and blinded by this worldview because it makes you feel safe and comfortable with the world, even if it's not reality. So with that, freedom is very fragile, and hopefully enough people make the right decisions to ensure that freedom and democracy continues a long time in the United States and around the world. But it's up to us. So as always, billions of years led to you, so make the most of it.